Hey, y'all, you should sign up for my Substack. It's scotthortonshow.substack.com. And if you do that, you'll get the interviews a day before everybody else. But not only that, they'll be free of commercials. How do you like that? Pretty good, huh? scotthortonshow.substack.com. All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. Hey, you guys, on the line, I've got Branko Marcetic. That's how I say it. I'm a Texan, I don't know. Eastern European names, what do I know? But I do know this. Like I said on Fox Business Channel a couple of weeks ago, he's the author of Yesterday's Man about Joe Biden. And he's a guy, 99% sure this is where I first learned that the first thing that Joe Biden did when he joined the U.S. Senate in 1973 was denounce Richard Nixon's hasty and precipitous withdrawal from Vietnam. And there's a lot of other great stuff in there, too, about what a horrible bastard Joe Biden is. But I'm glad I had a chance to say the title of your book on Fox. Welcome to the show. How you doing, Branko?
Hey, great. Thanks for having me. And I didn't realize that you gave me a shout out, but I appreciate that.
I try to fit as many points in a minute and a half as I possibly can. It ain't easy, but yeah. So anyways, also writing for Jacobin here, the quiet merger between online platforms and the national security state continues. And so, geez, it was 9 years ago, 9.5 that Ed Snowden leaked all of that stuff. And man, did a bunch of important news stories come out of there. And then since then, we've had the Vault 7 leak and slight reforms by the Congress and a couple of things struck down by the courts. But I think we got a pretty wide eye onto just how well they're surveilling us. It's essentially to unlimited degrees, whatever they want. And the most important one of the Snowden things to me was they keep your location data. And this is my paranoia about cell phones in the first place in the 90s. Was, don't you get it? They're going to triangulate your ass everywhere you go. Yeah, not only that, we know they keep your records of everywhere you've been for the last 5 years at least. Every living room you sat in, every bedroom you've been in, every backseat of a car you rode in, and who else was with you in that car or whatever it is. It's just unlimited, just, East German Stasi in their wildest dreams could have never come up with this stuff. And then you have this Web 2.0 where they got us in these really great and functional and fun and addictive walled gardens like Facebook and Twitter. And of course, the one and only preeminent search engine, which doesn't work nearly as well as it used to, but still better than all the rest of them, Google. And the major question then, where does the U.S. national government begin and end? And the same for Silicon Valley. It really is one and the same thing to such a great degree. And but as you write here, we're finding out more and more about how blurry that line is and the shape of it. So I guess, first of all, can we start with this recent report in The Intercept by Ken Klippenstein about the Department of Homeland Security and their efforts to influence social media in America? I know there's a hell of a lot there, but then again, you just wrote a piece reviewing it also.
Yes, so the Ken Klippenstein and Lee Fang obtained these government documents through this lawsuit that was launched over basically tech censorship, particularly to do with the Hunter Biden laptop story, which I think we all remember. There's a lot in there, as you say. A lot of it is basically it's DHS officials, and particularly this one sub-agency within the DHS, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And what we see in these documents is discussions about what the federal government can do, and particularly the Department of Homeland Security, in concert with all these private firms, to basically control the spread and the impact of what they call MDM, so misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And a lot of that is the discussions are actually not to do with direct government censorship. A lot of it's to do with things like increasing information literacy and boosting quote unquote authoritative or trusted sources, or directing people to trusted sources, and giving funding to particular sources that are considered trusted, and so on and so forth. So that's not so bad, but I think it is important to note that censorship is a part of what was going on as well. I mean, one of the things that Fang and Klippenstein point out is that among the documents, there's one that outlines the use of a government portal that lets government officials, law enforcement officials, basically suggest what posts on Facebook and Instagram they think should be suppressed. Beyond that, even though the people involved in these discussions are constantly saying, it's not a good idea for the government to censor, let alone to even just serve as a clearinghouse for information, because that could seem to be government propaganda. Whether the government is doing it directly or indirectly, that is still government-driven censorship, and that's really what's going on. I mean, they're pushing these tech firms to throttle information that they see as misinformation, or in some ways harmful. Another example of that is the Hunter Biden laptop story, which I just mentioned. In the lawsuit that Fang and Klippenstein draw, it's mentioned that the FBI was directly involved in pushing Twitter and Facebook to censor the laptop story. I mean, I don't know if people remember, but when that story hit, when the New York Post released it, you were not able to share that story on Twitter. You couldn't even send it to someone in a private DM.
Importantly, in October of 2020, it was the Republicans' big October surprise against the Democrats. And somehow they erased it off of the internet, which sounds impossible, but they did it effectively enough.
Yeah, and that was at a time when I think was it a few dozen, maybe more, intelligence officials also signed this letter saying this is just Russian disinformation, and a whole host of outlets published that uncritically. We now know that I mean, I think it was obvious at the time as well, but we now know for sure that is not true. The laptop and its contents are not Russian disinformation. That claim has simply disappeared. But that also led outlets like NPR, for instance, to say, what, we're just not going to cover the story at all because we think there's no basis. I mean, obviously there is a partisan motivation for them to do that too, but I think the fact that they had this cover added to it. So I mean, and there's other details in the lawsuit. They point to this podcast interview with another FBI official who kind of boasts about the fact that the FBI was in close contact with tech firms. He says sometimes on a monthly or even a weekly basis, asking them what they're seeing, telling them what they're seeing, and sort of coming up with what they think should be suppressed. There's also talk of I think on February 18th, some of the participants mentioned that with tensions between Russia and Ukraine rising, they need to have more discussions about what they can do in the information space around that whole conflict. And sure enough, I mean, since then, what have we seen? We've seen that Facebook changed its rules around calls for violence and around praising Nazis. So, but only specifically in the context of the Ukraine war, and only specifically.
By changed, you mean they lifted the restriction on them?
Exactly. Yeah. So used to be you couldn't call for violence on Facebook. It seems like at the behest of the US government, Facebook said, you know what, now you can call for violence, but only if you're calling for violence against Russian leadership. So, if a person posts something like death to Putin, that's okay. Used to be that you couldn't praise Azov, the Azov regiment, which is a far-right regiment made up of neo-Nazis and other ultranationalists, very dangerous outfit. For years, that was banned. Now they changed it. They said, "Oh, well, you know what? You can praise them, but only under limited circumstances. If you say that they're brave for defending Ukraine, then that's okay." Which to me seems actually more dangerous and propagandistic. If you sort of put their contribution to the war in such an anodyne way. But there you go. And we've there's been other examples beyond that. PayPal, for instance, shuttered some independent news outlets.
The Great
Just
Consortium News.com.
Yep, Consortium News,
Which
Mint
is
Press.
just criminal. Like, how dare they? Joe Lauria, their editor, was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal for 20 years, for the London Times. And his predecessor, the founder and editor, was Robert Perry from Newsweek and the Associated Press. And they're going to say, oh, nope, you don't exist now. To them? To anyone then.
It's outrageous, and it's key because both of those outlets were very critical of the kind of let's say established Western narrative on the war, including in some of the stuff that I've talked about. The role and the nature of the Azov regiment, and PayPal didn't just show their accounts; it actually seized the funds that they had. So not only did it make fundraising harder for these outlets, which are already running on fumes. You're not making a ton of money if you're an independent outlet on the web. But then they also said, well, the money that you have collected, well, now that's ours, and maybe we'll give it back to you later on. We'll see. And they didn't really give a very good reason for why they shut them down. But I think it's obvious that the war has something to do with it. So there's a lot in there. I would encourage people to read my piece. I'd encourage people to read the original Intercept. I would encourage people to click through all the links in all of those and actually have a read of the documents themselves and see what's being said. It's pretty long, but it's interesting stuff. And you'll get a sense of this. What the headline calls this kind of creeping merger of these two entities.
Mm. So you have a great paragraph here, all important, just in 75 words or something. The University of Adelaide and Stanford University both did these studies about what John Robb calls the Twitter swarm, and essentially, and I guess the Facebook swarms too, and what have you, and to show just how much of this is centrally and artificially directed. Sort of like, well, the other October surprise of 2020, the FBI's fake kidnapping plot, where 10 out of 12 plotters were FBI informants. How much of that is the Twitter swarm too? FBI informant bots going around pretending to love Israel and want to arm Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Snowden before. Among the many revelations in the Snowden documents was this particular document that outlined some of the powers that U.S. government agencies have to manipulate things online. And that, we're talking about at this point, 2008, 2010, that kind of period. So this is old stuff in many ways. They talked about the way that they could create accounts to spread particular information, particular narratives. They talked about the way that some agencies have the power to come in and edit comments on with their videos, on news stories and the like. So this isn't new, but I mean the scale of it is pretty remarkable. In that University of Adelaide study, they looked at 5 million tweets. This is a pretty massive sample size, and what they found was that in any given hour, the likelihood of a tweet on the Ukraine war in either direction being from a bot was it would hover between 60 and 80%. And then when they looked at the tweets that were coming from bots, 90% of those tweets was sort of pro-Ukraine tweets. Now, obviously Ukraine is being attacked by Russia. Morally, it's not difficult to know where you stand on that position. But I think it is significant that it reflects the fact that the way that our perceptions of this war are being shaped, not just by tech firms, not just by private actors who are using their resources to try and sway people one way or another, but specifically by the U.S. government. Overwhelmingly, we hear so much, I think, in U.S. discourse and in the West more generally about Russia, about China, about Iran, about how these countries are kind of coming in and trying to manipulate us online. But it turns out it's actually the United States government that's doing the most to do that. And it's not just the narratives that they're pushing forward aren't necessarily just things like go Ukraine, which I would say most level-headed people agree with. They're pushing stuff like trying to obscure the causes of the war, telling us that all this entire thing is purely about Russian expansionism and imperialism and Putin being Hitler and the like, instead of some of the stuff that I know you and myself and a host of other commentators who have been kind of attacked have tried to stress, which is that there is a very important role for U.S. Foreign policy in the cause of this war that we have to understand. So it has a potentially a bad impact overall. And I'll just add one more thing, which is that where I first found out about this study was from Consortium News. So there you go. One of the outlets that is being censored for supposedly pushing malinformation or whatever. And yet it turns out that without it, we might not know about some of the ways that public opinion is being shaped and manipulated by the U.S. government.
Hang on just 1 second. Hey, y'all, the audiobook of my book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, is finally done. Yes, of course, read by me. It's available at Audible, Amazon, Apple Books, and soon on Google Play and whatever other options there are out there. It's my history of America's war on terrorism from 1979 through today. Give it a listen and see if you agree. It's time to just come home. Enough Already. Time to End the War on Terrorism. The audiobook. Hey guys, I've had a lot of great webmasters over the years, but the team at expanddesigns.com have by far been the most competent and reliable. Harley Abbott and his team have made great sites for the show and the Institute, and they keep them running well, suggesting and making improvements all along. Make a deal with expanddesigns.com for your new business or news site. They will take care of you. Use the promo code SCOTT and save $500. That's expanddesigns.com. Man, I wish I was in school so I could drop out and sign up for Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom instead. Tom has done such a great job on putting together a classical curriculum for everyone from junior high schoolers on up through the postgraduate level. And it's all very reasonably priced. Just make sure you click through from the link in the right margin at scotthorton.org. Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Real history, real economics, real education. Yeah, man. Well, I remember interviewing this guy a couple of years ago about how, I can't remember, I think he was an Australian. I don't know. And he did some study about just manipulating Google search results. And I guess his conclusion was that people use Google to search, like, what's the closest burger stand, or which way's north from here, or 2 + 2 = what, and this kind of like simple factual stuff all the time. And the first result is just taken as truth. And it usually is like, is it raining right now, or is it about to be, or something, well, I don't know, weather's a bad example, but you know what I mean. And then so people are trained like that to just accept the first result as essentially the answer to whatever they're looking for. So then if they start searching for candidates, and he tried, I guess he did the test over and over and over again, if he skews the test for Democrat names, he ends up getting a much more positive result in terms of, I forgot what it was later, how he measured their support for the different candidates, or what, how they ended up voting, or whatever it was. But anyway, and it's the same for the Republicans. If he just switched it and made it where the first few results all showed Republican candidates, that essentially, because people are so well trained to just take that as a factual answer, like where's the closest gas station kind of a thing, which is the candidate for my district. Oh, it's this guy. And then that just, the power of suggestion there was immeasurable, he said. Well, not immeasurable, but measurable, but very high. And then so I guess the idea was that they go, yeah, great. We just do that. then we'll de-rank you and we'll rank him up and de-boost that and unfollow this and shadow ban over here and tweak this a little bit. And they know that ultimately, they can, to a great degree, influence, if not outright control the narrative all over the place.
Well, that's interesting and alarming, and I mean, I agree with you what you were saying that Google has become less useful. I think it's a direct result of this kind of push to have it reflect quote unquote authoritative sources or quote unquote trusted sources, which I mean, it's just evident. When I look at Google now, when I look something up, if it's something to do with anything news, anything political, I'll be greeted by, pages upon pages of kind of basically the same story being rewritten in different ways by the New York Times, NPR, Washington Post, so on and so forth, really telling me the same things over and over and over again. Whereas the old Google, you would have that, but you would also have a mix of kind of more alternative sources that you could kind of, you could maybe learn something new there. That doesn't mean that the alternative sources were always completely accurate, or that everything in them was exactly what one would agree with. But you would find some interesting alternate information. I mean, I guarantee you now, if you went on Google and you looked up, is Azov Regiment a far right group or something along those lines, I'm sure that the top results would be the spate of articles from quote unquote authoritative sources, the Telegraph, Deutsche Welle, or other outlets saying, oh, Azov has really changed its stripes. Now it's not really a far right organization anymore. And my piece for Jacobin, which is a comparatively little known and not as well resourced left wing publication, which really goes into the evidence of has Azov really changed? I'm sure would be driven to the second page because it's not considered a quote unquote authoritative source.
Yep. Well, in fact, I just Googled it, and one of the first ones is much Azov about nothing. The Ukrainian neo-Nazis canard. And then they have Al Jazeera profile and mapping militants. I'm going to read this one later. That looks interesting. And, it depends on from what time period stuff comes up. Anything from, up until last year or late last year will tend to have some pretty bad stuff in it. And then this year they had to start rewriting it all. Say, look, this real ass Nazi torchlight parade in the middle of the night in honor of Stepan Bandera. Oh, that's nothing like those terrorist university kids in Donald Trump golf uniforms with their tiki torches. That's some real terrorism there, but these guys who are, look straight out of some black and white footage from the 30s, never mind them. Anyway, yeah, it is. It's really amazing to see the way that they're able to do it. And, I don't know. You ever read this guy, John Robb, Global Guerrillas?
I haven't heard of him.
Okay, so he's like a former military guy and some kind of strategist during World War II, although by his own account, maybe not the best one, but it's an interesting book he wrote anyway. But he's kind of a futurist, and particularly on like fourth generation warfare and all this and that. And here he's like arguing that essentially the Twitter swarm makes even nation states obsolete, where it's not, the power isn't even in Biden's hands to negotiate with Putin right now. It's really whether the girl from Who's the Boss and her friends approve or not, and their moral judgment of whether this is, Chamberlainian appeasement of Hitler or this kind of thing, and how the way he puts it, all media, everything, all political, all party politics, everything is all downstream from Twitter. And, the madness of this swarm. And it's the same people who, went around doing all the Me Too and the cancellation over, this or that transgression or whatever. Now they've moved to this. They were the COVID hysterics, and the rest. And how his take, I guess, essentially is there's no stopping them. I guess your take is, well, but the government has the ability, and other forces too, I guess, but especially the government has the ability to really push and direct and manipulate this swarm and get them essentially chanting whatever Bellingcat says or whatever it is that they need. By the way, that's one of the first things that came up on the front page is their take on Azov, which I know has changed recently. You know, they used to say, "Hey, these guys are pretty dangerous," but then they quit saying that. But anyway, so that's what John Robb is about. Is that like it's the madness of the Twitter mob now that we're even sort of like the empire itself. It's just out of control. Nobody can drive this ship. It's just a free for all of corruption and violence.
Well, I mean, I think we saw that with the brouhaha of the progressives' incredibly mild letter suggesting ever so gently that diplomacy might be a good idea to prevent us all from dying in a nuclear war, let alone to have this war continue grinding on for Ukrainians to just keep dying and dying. And what happened? I mean, it was overwhelmingly the response, I would say, on Twitter that led the progressives to withdraw that letter, which, by the way, I don't think they should have done. I think that the events that followed shortly after showed very clearly they could have stood by what they had done and held their own. But whatever. I mean, it does show you how it does have an impact. And remember, I mean, as you said, it's a global resource. It shapes discourse everywhere, certainly in English speaking countries. It shapes discourse. It has already to a great degree. I mean, the discussion I see on Twitter as it regards to the war in Ukraine, the possibility or even desirability of nuclear war is in an entirely different universe to when I speak to normal people who aren't on the platform. So it's a very dangerous thing, and it's because of the fact that it's such a global reach, and the fact that the U.S. government has such a direct line into the decision making of what happens at these firms. The other governments do not. I mean, certainly the Russian and Chinese governments don't, but not even European governments have that kind of control. I mean, that is a really pretty extreme power for anyone to be able to kind of decide what can and can't be said on a global platform that shapes what is and isn't allowed in public discourse across multiple countries around the world.
Yeah. Hey, by the way, I just want to work in parentheses here. I'm glad you guys are publishing Daniel Lazare over there, Lazar, because I really like him, but he is just way too communist to write for us at antiwar.com anymore. But we had our differences, but I still think he's really sharp, and a lot of his takes on foreign policy are just so great. So I'm glad he landed somewhere.
Well, we're we're a broad tent. We publish a lot of different people at Jacobin, on the
and we do too at
so.
antiwar.com. We include all the way to the left and pretty damn far to the right, as long as it's good on war. Of course, you've been a regular for a long time, and we featured him for a long time, but eventually we just had our differences. But point is, though, I still really like him, and so I was happy to see his byline on the right-hand margin there as well.
Yeah, well, I think it's important when it comes to war, certainly in foreign policy in the US. It's good to have a little bit of cross-ideological, work on that front, because it's such a massive and powerful entity that's kind of being fought that I think ideological silos aren't helpful on that particular issue.
Yeah. It's funny because as we're talking, a guy on Twitter is accusing me and I guess then all libertarians of being Marxists because I said something about what we're against is essentially the power elite, right? The consolidated power of the corporate elite and the national government. And that doesn't mean that I want a centralization of power, the nationalization of property, or any kind of thing like that. I'm arguing for radical laissez-faire in opposition to that. But all a right-winger can hear is, oh, if Wall Street is bad, then that makes you a communist, this kind of thing. When my point really is that, and this is how I felt about this since I was even a teenager, was that all of my right-wing friends and all of my left-wing friends are essentially broke and powerless relatively, and that's the American people, right? That's everybody. And then there's the ultra-powerful who control the biggest firms, and especially the arms industry and all that, and the national security state. The national government, the most violent, corrupt parts of the national government, like the Pentagon and the FDA and things like that, and how it should just be not a right wing or left wing war at all. It could even be a libertarian one, but just an American, truly 99.99% against the actual evil, corrupt power that's got this country in a stranglehold, man. And that's something that we should all be able to agree on doing without having a communist revolution or a right wing reactionary one, or even my total paradise of total decentralization and laissez faire economics, but just absolutely put an end to these intolerable violations. I mean, in the 1990s, it was even the know your customer regulations that said that every bank has to snitch on every customer to the feds now with no warrant, with no nothing. They just have an open door into everybody's bank account. Well, what in the hell is that? And of course, everything Snowden revealed and the rest, Vault 7 and the rest of that just makes know your customer pale. No one remembers that. No one remembered that after September 11th even. But the thing is, out here in the country, it should be the case that all of us can be united against corruption on Wall Street, corruption in the military industrial complex, in pharmaceuticals, in agriculture, and in government, in the national security state, and all their wars, and then especially all of their evil electronic police state that the worst science fiction methed out madman could have never dreamed of, that they have been able to establish with the National Security Agency, the FBI, and the CIA against the people of this country, DHS too. Now all their influence, even and censorship over how we're allowed to talk and communicate with each other over the internet, all this dialing down and shadow banning and fake swarms and all this crazy. Everybody ought to be against this, just like everybody ought to be for, assuming you support the status quo of this Constitution whatsoever, then don't you think we should have like free and fair elections that with like easily recountable ballots and these kinds of things? Like no matter where you come from on the spectrum, you think we should have elections every 2 years still, right? And that we should have ballots that people can trust and whatever. All this basic stuff. This should be for everyone. I mean, obviously us libertarians are the ones who got it really straight, but all the rest of you were invited to oppose all the worst things about our government. And isn't that the great realignment, the people versus the power? How could it be anything but that? And if it's the 99% or the 99.99%, well, that's not just the radical left. That's got to be like, yeah, and we're not against everything. We're just against these bankers getting free money from the government at our expense. We're against these arms manufacturers lobbying to expand NATO and start a war so they can sell fighter jets and all these obvious things. You guys, as Bill Hicks would say, in your hearts, you all know the arguments. Everybody knows what we're talking about here. Everybody does, right?
I have no doubt that, on a variety of issues we will have disagreements, but, on certain things, I think there's a lot of overlap, but, whether you're conservative, liberal, socialist, libertarian, whatever. You mentioned DHS. I mean, that's one area where I think a lot of different people's interests overlap in terms of kind of restraining that particular agency, because DHS is not just involved in this particular thing that we're talking about here. There's been a spate of stories over the last, I don't know, 3-4 months about how DHS is basically start acting as a domestic surveillance agency. DHS is supposed to exist to, well, sure, it maintains the security of the United States, and it's sort of supposed to uphold immigration laws and maintain the border and that kind of thing. But it's in the pursuit of those goals, it started to. You mentioned geolocation data. Well, the DHS is now, a major customer of these private firms that collect and store all this geolocation data that we're constantly, unwittingly pinging around. And so it has just a massive trove of information on basically every adult in the United States and where they've been, what their movements are like. It does the same for a variety of other private firms that collect information, so for instance, firms that have information around utility bills, DMV records, a whole bunch of stuff that reveals, again, a stunningly vast amount of intimate information about not just the people that they are ostensibly targeting, but every adult American, basically. And I think that's really worrying. I mean, we saw what happened with DHS during the the protests in 2020 against police brutality in Portland and other places, the way that suddenly American streets began to look like, you know, a street in war-torn Iraq or something. The way that these kind of armored DHS officers were you know, walking around, patrolling, even seizing people off the sidewalk and shoving them into vans. And you know, so I think if you're a libertarian who's worried about the government kind of treading on you and trampling your rights and doing all sorts of scary authoritarian stuff, or if you're a liberal or any kind of lefty who's worried about the way that these agencies have expanded their role and the way that they target immigrants, the way that they kind of break apart families, all this kind of stuff, I think regardless of what side you're coming from, you have an interest and a motivation to try and kind of restrain what is, to me, just a rapidly broadening remit for this colossally wasteful and opaque agency in the United States.
Yeah, man. All right. Well, listen, I'll let you go and have a rest of a good weekend, I hope. But sure appreciate your great writing and your time on the show, as always, Branko.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate what you guys are doing in anti-war as well.
Right on. Thanks, man. All right, you guys. That is Branko Marcetic. He's at Jacobin.com. And this was called The Quiet Merger Between Online Platforms and the National Security State Continues.
The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.